All right. Thank you everyone for attending this morning. Today we're going to be looking at SmartConnect, and our topic for this webinar is going to be in the introduction to NetSuite integrations. And if you're not familiar with either SmartConnect or NetSuite, this is a great entry point for us to jump in on it. What I'm going to run through is a brief overview of SmartConnect, and then we'll look at how we can connect to NetSuite and use it for both a data source and a destination for any integrations that you may want to be setting up. So before we begin, just a quick introduction for myself here. My name is Chris Hansen. I'm the SmartConnect product manager with E1 Solutions. On the screen there, we've got a picture of my family out at a state park that we like to visit every year. And what we're going to be going through today is, like I mentioned, just the overview of SmartConnect. If you haven't seen that before, at least get you an idea of what we're using our integration platform for. Then we're going to take a look at NetSuite, because there's a lot of configuration or setup that has to be done within the NetSuite solution itself before we can go ahead and connect to their web services and start setting up our integrations. So when we're creating our NetSuite connection, there are a couple different types of authentication that we can use. So we'll walk through each one of those. So anyone that is on this webinar now, or if you reference it in the future, you should have a step-by-step process to get that connection up and in place. Once we've got the connection created, we're going to look at the two different types of data sources that we can configure, and then also discuss our future plans for enabling new data sources on the integrations. Finally, we'll look at the different destination options, and then we'll open up to question and answer at the end of this session. So to start with, if you're not familiar with SmartConnect at all, SmartConnect's our no-code integration platform, and we use it for a variety of different scenarios. So I'm actually going to switch ahead to this main graphic that I like quite a bit. Now, when we're configuring SmartConnect and what we're using it for, we're able to go ahead and connect anything from the data source section at the top of this graphic to anything in that destination at the very bottom. Now, the types of integrations you may set up can differ from scenario to scenario. So you may just want to use SmartConnect for a migration solution, where you're doing a one-time run of this data that's going from point A to point B, or you may want it as an ongoing synchronization tool, where we keep all of your data up to date between each of the systems. So any one of these connections listed in here, and this isn't a comprehensive list, these are just our most popular ones between the data source and the destination, where we pick the data up and where we send it to. But it gives you an idea of where we can transfer the data to and from. Now, the middle two sections is where we define, how the integration is run. So that trigger section is, do we want this to be a manually run process? Are we going to schedule it and automate it? Or is this going to go through different APIs or web services? Essentially, how is your integration going to trigger and how frequently that's going to run? Now, the section below that, the transform, that's where we get some of the most use out of it. And this is where SmartConnect ensures that even if your data isn't perfect, or if the data doesn't match between systems, we're able to go ahead and do the transformation as needed. We can come up with new values. We can do different scripting within the tool. So it just allows us to go ahead and create an integration between two systems that may not be linked directly together by default. Now, since we have that overview covered, we're just going to go ahead and dive directly into each of our systems here. So I mentioned we're going to have to do some work inside of NetSuite to ensure that we've got everything configured the way we want it. So what we'll be focusing on today is both NetSuite and then SmartConnect.com as the deployment method of SmartConnect that we're going to be working in. Now, to clear everything up in terms of how we connect with NetSuite, right now we have a connection point for NetSuite that is available in our SmartConnect.com deployment. We don't have the NetSuite connection enabled in our on-premise client, the Windows client, yet today. That is on the roadmap for the end of the year for the Windows client, and then you'll be able to connect to NetSuite from either version of SmartConnect. But for today, we're working with SmartConnect.com. And like I said, we're going to jump into NetSuite to start with, because we want to make sure that we've got NetSuite configured in a way to enable their web services so we can connect with whatever authentication type we need. So the first thing you do, obviously you need a valid NetSuite account, but once you have a NetSuite account in place, we want to make sure that the features are enabled to turn on their different APIs that we work with. So I'm going to go through our setup company and go to the enable features section. And this is where we're going to look at what they have is they call it their Suite Cloud offering. So this is their different APIs, a few of which are ones that we connect to with SmartConnect. So once we're on the Enable Featured section, we're going over to Suite Cloud for the tab. And then where we're going to be interested is in the authentication and the Suite Talk section. So the web services that we interact with it's the NetSuite Suite Talk services. And we're working with their SOAP API at this point. They do have a new REST web service option, but it's still in beta. So while that remains in beta, we're going to stick with their standard method for connecting to their system. So first, we want to ensure that these SOAP web services are enabled inside of NetSuite. The second thing we need to check is in the Manage Authentication section. So we need to ensure that either token-based or Suite sign-on is enabled. Now, those are our two authentication types that we work with SmartConnect. So I'll walk us through step by step what it takes to set up that connector using either of those two options. And I'll talk to the pros and cons of each as we go through them. So as long as those options are marked and our SOAP web service option is enabled as well, that means we're going to be able to connect to this NetSuite tenant with SmartConnect. So I'm going to switch over to smartconnect.com and we'll take a look at our connections tab, as this is where we would define any system that we want to pull data out of or send data into. So this is the first thing we need to set up when we're determining where we send data to or where we pull it from. Now I've got a couple connections in here, so I could use either one of them, or I could go ahead and create a new one from scratch for this particular webinar. That's what I'll go with in this scenario. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create Connection, and we'll see the list of all the different connections we have available for SmartConnect. In our case, we're going to be looking at the NetSuite option. When I open that up, we're going to have a window where we need to define what we want to connect to. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. You should probably give it a more descriptive name than I've done here, so you know what tenant or what environment you're connecting with. But once we put the description in, we get to go ahead and decide how we want to connect. So that's where I mentioned we want to ensure that either Suite sign-on or token-based authentication is able in NetSuite to let us connect. Now, I'll spend the majority of this webinar on the section to set up the connection. And the reason I'm doing that is once we have the connection created and we can pull data from it or send data to it, it's very similar to the rest of SmartConnect in terms of how you set up an integration. The way you do your field mapping, the additional columns, any tasks, the scheduling, automation, all that's the same as if you were setting up any other integration. The main difference is getting this authentication, getting that connection created in the first place. So what we'll do is we'll look at the Suite sign-on option first, and we'll actually walk through NetSuite in terms of where you find each of these required fields. I'll fill in the ones that I'll know just offhand and what you could be expected to know offhand as a user, and then we'll dive into NetSuite and find the ones that you probably don't have memorized just because it's not something you use commonly. So the username and password, this would be the username and password if you're using Suite sign-on, what you connect to NetSuite with normally when you log into their system. So this is an account that I know an email for, I know the password, I can fill those both in without issue. Now the application ID, role ID, and account ID, those are not things that you normally know offhand. So we have to go into NetSuite to go ahead and find and locate them and pull them in for using our integration. So the first thing we'll look for is the application ID. Now inside of NetSuite, they have a section under their setup tab defined for integration. This is where we can go ahead and either generate a new application ID or pull one off of an existing one. So what we'll do is go to integration and manage integrations. We'll click on this, and this is where they allow you to define, in NetSuite, they just call it a different integration or an application that you can use. So inside of here, this is just assigning everything that's going to connect to their web services is actually going to flow through one of these integration accounts that we're making. So I've got a couple of them in here. The one that I created just this morning and we'll use for this particular account, I just happen to name it SmartConnect column for the system. And you can see on the list beforehand, but you can also see in here that we've got an application ID that we can use for our setup. So all we need to do is copy paste this out of this environment and we can throw it into the setup window within SmartConnect. Now this application ID is actually going to be used across both authentication types, whether we're doing suite sign-on or whether we're doing token-based. And it just allows NetSuite and us to go ahead and set up different authentication around it, whether we're allowing the user credentials, which would be suite sign-on, or if we're only letting tokens be used for authentication. So in this case, I enabled it for both because I want to make sure this is going to work for either scenario that we set up. So grab that application ID off of there, and we'll just drop that onto, well, I did that incorrectly. Let's try that again. I should be able to go ahead and copy paste that directly from here. There we go. And it'll drop into place. Now the role ID and the account ID, since we're doing suite sign-on, this is tied to an individual user account, right? We're not setting this up to run through anyone, or we're not setting this to run up through a token-based system where users have to be added as a role or as a permission to it. Instead, we're tying it to our individual account. So we need to grab the role ID and the account ID that we're working with on here. And where we do that is once again through the setup window that we have. So when we go to setup, we go to integration. We're going to go ahead and take a look at the SOAP web service preferences because we can find both of them from here. So the very first thing that we'll find is right across the top. This is the account ID. This should be the same. This will only change when you have a different NetSuite tenant. So it doesn't matter what user you're logged into NetSuite with, as long as it's the same tenant that other users access, that will not change. So I can go ahead and grab that account ID to use that for the first one in here. And then the role ID is going to be coming from whatever role they've been assigned. So my demo@e1 solutions email is actually tied to Amy for my username here within NetSuite. It's one of the default ones we have in our demo environment. Now, since we're connecting to the SOAP web services, if we're doing it through suite sign-on, we have to go ahead and add each one of the accounts that we want to be able to connect with their credentials. We have to put them in here, and we have to just define what role they have to connect to that web service. So if we're setting up a connector within SmartConnect, we want to ensure that they've got the top level of permissions, which means if you're using that connector when you set up the integration, you can go ahead and pull data from any available object or send data to any object in NetSuite and not worry about the connector failing because the account doesn't have enough rights or enough permissions. So when you pick that role, if you pick administrator, the ID is a 3. If you pick a different role, the ID is going to change depending on which option we grab from that dropdown. But ideally, we want administrator, so we're not going to have a permission issue when it connects. So once we plug all that in, we can go ahead and click validate, and that should validate our connection to NetSuite. We'll let it sit here and ensure everything comes across. If it works, we're going to get our connection to NetSuite was successful. So that's suite sign-on. The main thing behind that is we're using a specific user account to connect, and then they get added to the SOAP web service preferences. They get a role with how many permissions they get to connect to that. So anyone that goes into SmartConnect and uses this connection now, whether we're sending data in or pulling data out, if you looked at the audit trail in NetSuite, it's going to show it as this account, our demo@e1 solutions, has made that connection and is running through there to access the data. So the benefit to this is it's fairly straightforward to set up. You just have to ensure they have a web service role, and beyond that, all that information is readily available. Now the other option is the token-based authentication. Now this is, in my preference, this is a better route to go because we're actually setting up a specific integration application. We're setting up a token to go along with that. We don't have to worry about the user ever changing their password or leaving the company because you can assign different users that have permission to the token in the integration application that we set up. So if we switch this around, we can now go ahead and create I'll show you where to get the token ID, the token secret, the consumer secret, and key. So it's a little bit more set up initially, but overall it's going to give you a connection that's more secure and one that's easier to maintain because we don't have to worry about passwords changing at a later point in time. Now the account ID, we already have, that's the one constant between the two options. We have to know what tenant we're working with in NetSuite. So again, that's in that so web services preference window. So we're still on that here. So that we already have, we don't have to worry about it. For a couple of the other options, we need to work with different keys and secrets here. So these get generated one time when you initially set it up in NetSuite. And if you don't record that information when you set it up, it's never visible within the application again because of their security model. So if we miss out on that token ID and secret when you're creating them, or if you forgot to record them somewhere secure, you'll have to create new ones when you go through and build this out. So I'm going to use a combination of building a new one and using an existing one that I've already copied the information out from, just so it doesn't take a massive amount of time to step through it. But we'll walk through looking at both the consumer and the token options here. So let's first look at the consumer key and the consumer secret. So once again, all of this is handled under our setup menu inside the NetSuite. We're going to go to setup integration, and then we can go over to manage integrations from here. Now, as you can see, this is the same option where we got our application ID from, but if I open it up on here, the consumer key and secret are also recorded on any one of these integrations that we configure. But if you don't grab those when you initially create it, you don't have access to them again unless we go ahead and reset this particular integration, or if you go create a new one. Now, I don't want to reset this one because I've got this tied to other accounts that I'm using currently. So instead, I'll go ahead and create a new one so I can show everyone what this looks like if we're building a new integration from scratch here. So I'll call this SmartConnect, and I'm just going to do an underscore webinar, so we know that's a new name. We can put our description on here. We can enable or disable these different integrations that we create. And then for the authentication below, the only one we technically need if we're only doing token-based would be the top one. If we want to use this application for Suite sign-on or for token-based, then we're going to have both of those marked. But when we save this particular one that we created, it's going to generate that consumer key and the consumer secret. So these are the two values that only get displayed this one time. If you forget to copy them down, we have to reset them, which means anybody using this old key and this old secret would no longer work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy those out, and I'm just going to paste them onto my other screen here so I can reference those later when we need to plug them into SmartConnect. So that will be the consumer key and the consumer secret. So again, it's just another way of authenticating. They use these to ensure you are who you say you are when you want to connect. So once we have those, that's one half of the token that we need. The other half is we actually need the specific access token as well. Now to get that, there's a couple steps to go along with it. And this is where we start tying the individual web service permissions to different roles and to different users and assigning it out from here. So what we're going to do is, again, we're going to go to setup, but in this case, we're going to be looking at our user roles, and we're going to be looking at managing these roles inside of here. Because instead of tying this web service access to an individual person, we're instead tying it to a role, which can then be assigned to any users that we need in here. So again, this is why, from my perspective, it makes more sense to do the token-based for web service access, because you're no longer reliant on one user account staying the same to get permission to it. So what we'll do is, instead of doing a new one from scratch here, I'm going to be looking at this E1 token role instead, just because it takes a little bit of time if we want to build one from scratch to get the necessary permissions in there. So if I open this one up, what we're going to be looking at specifically is the different permissions down at the bottom. So you can name the role whatever you want within NetSuite. Again, if you're familiar with NetSuite, this should be fairly straightforward to anyone using that. If you're not familiar with NetSuite, you'll likely either have to follow this video step by step or find an article that helps you out on it. Now, what we're concerned with is the different permissions down here. So if we go and create this one, there's going to be a couple permissions that we need to ensure are in place. So if we go to lists inside of here, we want to make sure that we've actually got access to the employee record, the employees. At the very least, those have to be marked as, being able to view them. Beyond that, we also have to go ahead and ensure that they've got permissions to the specific web service access as well. So when we go ahead and look at our different setup options in here, we need to ensure that they've got access to the user access tokens and the web service piece. So those are the two minimums that we need in there. We need the setup for these two, and then we also need list for employee record and employees. Beyond that, that's where you tell NetSuite, and that's where you define what else you have access to if you connect to the web service in this manner. So just because we can connect to the web service doesn't mean you necessarily have access to everything inside of NetSuite. This allows you to define exactly what you want to be able to push or pull from there. So once we have this role set up and configured, the final step is going to be ensuring that role is assigned to the access in the subtab to the access tab for the employee itself. So once again, I'm going to go through our list here. I'm going to look at employees, and I want to show where we can go ahead and set that role up. So for our particular person, the demo at E1 Solutions here, it is working with Amy. I'm going to click on Edit. And like I mentioned, this is where we can assign the different roles where we need. So I can go down to the access section on here. And in addition to the 2 roles that I had before, I'm also going to have permission to I'm going to have access to that new role that I configured, that E1 token role, in addition to anything else we have through the interface. If it responds here. There we go. So these were the default ones that the Amy account had. They're an admin and also an AP clerk. But then that token role that we configure, we can assign that out to different users. Again, this is mainly if we're using the user-based authentication, but we can also define it within here. So when we created that role, what we didn't have on screen is what we would have done if it was created the first time, is we would have got the token and the token secret from that as well. Again, just displayed one time, just like it was when we set up the integration application. So the hardest thing is just ensuring that that is configured correctly. You copy that down, and then you've got that for use later. So because I have this on another window here, I'm able to copy paste each of these out. And it's going to allow us to go ahead and connect based on those values we're using. So most of these are hidden, so we can't see as we're pasting them in here. We should be able to save that. And now we have a valid connection for NetSuite, whether we're doing the webinar demo or if we're sticking with one of the options we used before. So that was quite a bit of stuff to walk through, but again, a lot of the initial setup, knowing NetSuite, knowing where to grab that information from, that's the hardest part of getting your integrations up and running, is making sure you've got a valid connection. Once that connection is in place, now we can go ahead and look at what we can do for pulling data out of NetSuite or sending information back into it. So let's just dive in right away and take a look at our data source section. So if you're not familiar with SmartConnect, this is where we get to define how we want to pull data out of any connection that we've configured. So for this particular webinar, we're going to be looking at the NetSuite option and how we can go ahead and pull data from that environment. Right now, for retrieving data from NetSuite, the only option we have is as a bulk source through their API. So we can go ahead and connect to their web service, to their API, pull any object or entity that they list in there, and get the data off of it. We can filter it down as needed, which I'll show in just a moment here, but we don't have a change or a real-time option for those immediate triggers that will send off integrations from any of our integrations we set up. Now, with that being said, at the time this is being recorded, our dev team and our QA team is looking at the real-time trigger option right now. They do have stuff they're testing out. There's a little bit of extra work that goes into deploying that in NetSuite to enable the real-time trigger. But once it's in place, the idea behind it is if an event occurs, like an insert or an update to a record, it immediately fires off any integration tied to that event. So I'd watch, for anyone looking at this, watching this webinar, look for a follow-up session to this once we do have that capability enabled for NetSuite. But for today, we're going to focus on the bulk source, and we're going to be looking at the query option inside of here. So I'm going to build a new bulk query from this window, and we're going to be using NetSuite as our connection point. So I'm just going to enter a name on here. Again, normally you'd name it something better than test data source. You'd name it, based off the type of data that we're pulling out. But we're just doing different tests to ensure that everyone knows each of the steps along the way here. Now for the connection itself, I've set up 3 different connections. So we see each of these in here. I can use any one of them. They're all connecting to the same NetSuite tenant. Throw our connection in, we'll ensure that validates, and then we'll get to go ahead and define our type of search or our type of query that we want to use when we connect to NetSuite. And there's 2 main types. We've got our save search and we have our custom filter. Both of these are going to get you access to the same data. The setup just either occurs mainly in NetSuite or mainly inside of SmartConnect. So it's going to be whatever system you're more familiar in is the option that I'd recommend using. And I'll walk through each here. So just a little bit of background in general. When we connect to NetSuite and we go through their SuiteTalk API, they give us access to any of the objects that they have within NetSuite. So the customer, employee, transactions, some of the setup info, we can all pull that back through SuiteTalk. Another thing they allow us to do is they allow us to create new saved searches in NetSuite and have them show up within SmartConnect and have them show up within their API for our use. And that's the first one we'll go with. So when I switch over to NetSuite, what we've got under here is when we look at reports, there's the option to create new saved searches within NetSuite. If you're familiar with financial systems or ERPs at all, these would be in your custom lists. If you use GP, it'd be like a smart list or smart list favorite. If you're using Business Central, it's one of those saved views that you can generate inside of there. You're just able to build your own collection of views, your own view, so you can filter down it to just the data we want to work with. Now, the nice thing is if you're familiar with NetSuite and you're very proficient at this, any one of these saved searches that you create is going to show up through their API. So let's go ahead and build a new one to ensure that I'm not fibbing while I'm on the webinar here. So what we'll do, we'll stick with a fairly simple one. We're just going to work with customers here. If we work with customer, it's going to apply to anything else that we can see in this list. It's just everybody's familiar with this type of object. Doesn't matter what system you work with. So the title on here, we'll call this SC Webinar. Just because I'm really good at coming up with names on the fly. We can put a title in there. We don't have to give an ID or anything else. And if I just preview this at this point, what it's doing is it's just looking at the customer object in NetSuite and pulling back all the results on here. So we're getting everything being returned from this. Now, let's add some filters to it to ensure that we're actually getting what we want to work with. So one, I'm going to ensure that, let's go ahead and say we need to make sure we've got some primary contact data filled in. We don't want that to be empty. And let's also ensure we've got, like, say, a company name on this as well. So I can go back to NetSuite criteria and I can add this to my list directly inside of here. So this filter, I'm just going to go ahead and type ahead. I believe it's actually the primary, just the contact. There we go, contact primary, those fields. So I want to ensure that my primary contact has some data in it. So I can go ahead and look at the name ID and I can ensure that it is not empty. So I'll go ahead and say, all right, that's got to ensure that we've got something filled in there. Let's also look at our company name. And when we put company name in, we'll ensure that that isn't empty either. So some fairly basic filters or criteria in here. But if you're familiar with NetSuite, you know all the different options you can do with these saved searches to go ahead and narrow them down. So they only show you that relevant data that you want to work with. So now as you can see, our primary contact, we've got data in each of them. Our name is populated for anything coming across here as well. So that looks like what we want to work with. So once your saved search is how you want it, we can go ahead and save this. It's going to add it to the list of saved searches inside NetSuite. And that also means the next time that we communicate with the SuiteTalk API, this is going to be pulled back as one of the endpoints that we can pull data from. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to close this down and reopen it because we just created that new saved search. So I want to make sure that we're querying NetSuite again when we open this up. And let's go back through and pull this in. So we'll go ahead and say new. Again, I'm very good at naming things on the fly. Do new data source 1, do our connection. And after we validate, we'll stick with the saved search. And then we get to go ahead and look at the different type and then pick the saved search we want from there. So I know we created a saved search that was under the customer type. This will grab our full list of entries from here. And once that pulls in, we should see the new one that's been configured. All right, now while that loads, I'm already forgetting what I named it. There we go, SC Webinar Save Search 1. I can drop that in, and now I can go ahead and save or preview this the way we want. Now, I didn't filter the column list at all on the Save Search side, so when I open this up, I believe I'm going to have a lot of extra columns that I may or may not want in here. So we actually have the ability to go ahead and select the individual columns we want. And we can do this on the custom search as well. And I wanted to point that out because it's a very important piece to it. So for example, my preview on here just returns the top 5 rows. Unfortunately, I didn't filter on everything in here. I just ensured that we'd have a name and a primary contact so we can get our email from there. But I didn't do any filtering on the rest of this data or the rest of these fields. So if I know there's a lot of columns that I don't need for my integration, I highly recommend that we use the select columns option to only pull in the relevant data. The reason this is important is because the more columns you pull, the more time it takes to pull that data in, just because you're working with more data. Even if there's nothing in those fields, it still takes the web service time to grab that information and pull it back. If we return less columns, it's a smaller amount of data we're working with, which speeds up the process when we call that data, and then also speeds up SmartConnect because we don't have as big of a data. It's not as big of a data table to work with when we're grabbing that information. So I can't remember all the different options in here, but if I wanted to, I could narrow this down just to a handful of columns that you know you're going to need to integrate out to another system. So this will preview this data again, and it should pull back just the columns that I put in place here. We will wait for this to preview. And again, as we add more columns, we can go ahead and see what we need to work with on there. But you can get just the relevant fields into your data source. So that's the save search where you do the majority of the work. Within NetSuite, you do your criteria, your filtering in there, you create the actual view or the actual search you want, and you go from that point. Also, if you've heavily used NetSuite already, you've got a bunch of save searches in place, you can just reference the ones that already exist. Now, the other option is to go ahead is to build it from scratch. So in this case, when we go to our NetSuite connection, we validate it. Instead of doing the save search, we're going to be using the second option in place here. Now, once this pulls in, we'll do our custom filter on there instead of picking the save search option. And from here, we essentially get to build our query from scratch. So it's doing the same type of work we did through the NetSuite interface, except we can do it from SmartConnect and we can build this on the fly. We don't have to create it and save it ahead of time. So if I go ahead and click the add filter option, this is where I get to pick our category, the type, and the data we want pulled back. Now, if you're looking at this category and you're not sure where each of these values are coming from, the label we have in here and how they've got their API broken out is based on their different menu items in here. So if you can find what you're looking for from the menu structure inside of NetSuite using transactions or lists or entities, etc., that's the same option we're going to use when we come through our category in here. So just to keep it, same data I worked with on the first one, same data I'll work with here, I'm just going to stick with our customer for this particular option. So do our customer. Once again, I can choose what columns I want to pull back. I'm not quite sure on which ones I want to work with yet. So instead, let's just focus on our filter row here. So this filter, same options we get inside of NetSuite. So I can go ahead and say, all right, there's my company name. My operator, once again, I've got all of our different comparisons if we want to have it be a contains. Right now, I'm just ensuring that we have data in there. I want to make sure that company name isn't empty, and I could go ahead and add additional columns if I want, but we'll just start with that one. I'll click update on here. Again, I could narrow down the columns if I want, but after we preview that, this will allow us to go ahead and grab the information out from NetSuite. Now, once this pulls back, again, we should see the same columns we get. I didn't filter it down, so it's going to be a massive amount of data being pulled in here. But these are the two main methods for getting that information out from NetSuite. So again, the hardest part of this is, from my perspective, actually being familiar with the NetSuite environment. If you're looking at this as an integration project, just because you can set up a connection to it, doesn't ensure you're going to know the details of the rest of the system. Either yourself or somebody else on your team that you work with should know the ins and outs of NetSuite and how that's going to work with SmartConnect and where the data is that you need to pull out. So we've got our data from here, so we can pull that data from either using that custom filter or the saved search. The last step when we're looking at NetSuite integrations is what it looks like as a destination. And once again, the good news is the NetSuite destination is no different from any other connection point that we have when we're treating it as, the destination system where we're sending that data to. So I'll go ahead and build a new integration in place now. I'll set it to a default. We'll call this our webinar map. I'll set it to a default data source. We'll just pull data in from a file or some location, so I can show the different menu screens, different menus, the different screens we'd walk through when we're filling in all that information. Do NetSuite destination. And again, if you haven't used SmartConnect before, these are kind of the three main sections we walk through. The connection is where we define any system we want to pull data from or send it to. Data source is how exactly we're pulling that data out of any system. And the integration process is where you tie those connections together and you do the individual field mappings when you're sending data to the destination system. So with our source, in this case, I've just got a default file on here. I'll just grab my Excel source. I believe I have a customer upload just to keep everything on the same track here. We'll upload customers from a file. We'll look at our source grouping, and I'll go ahead and say, all right, every customer number, that should be my grouping. So each unique customer number is going to be a different record as it runs through. Now for our target, let's go ahead and click the drop down here, and we're going to be going over to NetSuite. And once again, since I set up 3 different connections in this SmartConnect environment, I've got 3. Normally you're going to have just 1 unless you've got different NetSuite tenants in here. We'll do our webinar demo, and then we'll go ahead and get to choose where we want to send that information to. So in our case here, let's look for our customer. So we can do a type ahead if we want. So I can go ahead and find our customer entity we're sending it to. It's under the entities category. But you're not stopped there. We can go ahead and add additional ones. So if I'm working with both the customer and the contact, we can tie both of these into that one integration. We don't have to split this out between them. Also, if you're working with, say, a transactional integration, if we're working with, it's not order, let's look for our sales order is what they have it named. If we're working with our sales order transaction and add it in, let me take off these other 2 for a moment. We can check this box to say include role types. What this does is it's going to show any linked service or any linked object that goes along with it. So anytime you're doing a transactional integration, you're going to want to mark that box so you can map to both the header portion of the transaction and then the line item that you'd be working with. And that's what that checkbox allows us to do. If we're working with, say, a master record type option here, and again, it depends on the object we're working with, but if we open up our customer one, you check that box, you can see all of the different sub-objects that are under it. So it's a little bit more than our sales transaction, which is why I took it off before I expanded that out. So you can see we can map and integrate those fields, those sub windows that are part of that customer entity or any other object that we link in on here. For now, I'm going to keep it fairly straightforward just so it doesn't clutter our windows on the future screens here. We'll just look at the customer and the contact and the mapping screens that we'll use to map into them. The final thing I want to point out on here, just like for any other destination within SmartConnect, you can save the output of an integration to file. And I wanted to bring this up because it's very handy when you're doing troubleshooting for why an integration doesn't run. So this would take the output that SmartConnect would normally hand off to whatever API we're working with, and instead it will dump each record out into its individual file, and you can open it up and see what payload we're passing through. And the reason that's helpful is because way back at the beginning of this webinar, I mentioned SmartConnect is very useful when your data doesn't match perfectly between systems. That means we're going to be doing different translations and coming up with new data or potentially doing other lookups. And if you go to File, you can see what the output of all those translations or the output of all of those different transformations are as we run through. So the final thing, or the final step to creating a basic integration is this integration tab where we define what object we're sending the data to, and we do the actual individual field mappings inside of here. So first thing first, I'm going to group this by the customer number. I'll match our grouping to what it was earlier on the integration. And then the target integration field is where we send it to the destination fields. So any field that NetSuite displays on that object just like any other destination we use, whether it's customer engagement, Dynamics Nav, Business Central, Salesforce, etc. This screen doesn't really change in terms of the process you walk through. It's just the fields that change that we're actually mapping into on here. So I can go ahead and expand that out. I switched it over to all for my fields. It takes longer to pull everything in because NetSuite has to return every single field into one screen on here. But once it does, I won't have to switch between different pages as I'm mapping the specific fields in. So I did that, and then my browser is taking a moment to respond on here. But once it does, what we have on the side, the source name, that's going to be a drop down for all of the different fields that we could potentially map through from our source data. So any field that you know can be displayed directly across, that's what you're going to be able to use the drop down for and pull that information in. And if you have something that doesn't match perfectly, that's where we can switch over to the additional column, and I can go ahead and set up an additional column to either do that data translation, come up with new data, or clean up anything that doesn't look right before it gets sent across. But other than that, and again, my browser isn't being responsive on here, but normally that would display the rest of the fields without issue, and then we'd be able to map to it. At this point in time, it's taking its sweet time in displaying that. But the last thing I wanted to say is that the destination on NetSuite isn't different from any other system that we're working with. So there's no change between mapping to that or mapping to Business Central or Nav. The only thing that changes are the actual fields inside of it. So with that, what we have and what we walked through, again, just as a recap, is we took a look at the features that needed to be enabled within NetSuite itself to enable their web service and their SuiteTalk API in the first place. We walked through the different connection and authentication types. So whether you're using Suite Sign-On or the token-based authentication, showed everyone how to find the individual fields, the setup values that were needed to make that connection. And then we took a look at the data source section. So when we pull data out of NetSuite, we can either create a custom filter or a custom query from scratch where we build the entire web service call within SmartConnect, or we can make use of the saved searches within NetSuite and use what's already in place or use any searches that are built in the future. Finally, the NetSuite destination, the main thing there is it's the same as any other destination we work with in SmartConnect. The differences around that is the checkbox to go ahead and show like the child records when you're working with the main object or a main entity, and then the ability to add in multiple objects into that one mapping to cut down on the number of integrations that we need. So with that, that wraps up what I've got for this webinar today. At this point, if anyone has any questions, feel free to go ahead and message them in through the chat or the Q&A bar on here. Otherwise, if you're watching this recording or attending live, I've got my contact information on the slide that's currently displayed, along with our main e1solutions.com site. You can also go out to www.smartconnect.com. I'm not sure how that one got taken off of this slide, but that's the other main website that we have for SmartConnect that has our information on it. And then, yes, finally, thank you all that were attending here live. And for anyone that hasn't looked at NetSuite as a potential integration point before, after going through the session, you should have a good basis for setting up that connection and getting your hands into building the integrations out yourselves.